Okay, so welcome to part two of week 11 for the ISM 4003 Contemporary Documentary Media. The weekly topic again is entitled Sense and Sensibility Rethinking the Documentary Agency and Aesthetics in the Age of the Anthropocene. And you will recall that in the first part of this video, I provided a very short, brief definition of the Anthropocene, which is effectively the term that scientists and geologists have um, more recently developed in order to describe what they call the new geological epoch that has been ushered in with um, the unprecedented human intervention upon the natural environment, such that we need to, so these geologists argue, develop a new term following that of the Holocene entitled the Anthropocene to indicate this new epoch of human intervention, which perhaps marks, as a way of beginning to discuss, among other things, climate change in our contemporary world. And so, with that in mind, this question of the Anthropocene and documentary aesthetics in mind, and building on our previous discussion of In My Language, we can now turn to Lucian Casting Taylor and Verena Paravel's 2012 um, sensory ethnographic film, as they put it, Leviathan. And so we will now begin our discussion of Leviathan by first going into what they call the Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab. According to the Sensory Ethnography Lab website, quote, the Sensory Ethnography Lab, or SEL, is an experimental laboratory that promotes innovative combinations of aesthetics and ethnography. It uses analog and digital media, installation, and performance to explore the aesthetics and ontology of the natural and unnatural world. Harnessing perspectives drawn from the arts, the social and natural sciences, and the humanities, the SEL encourages attention to the many dimensions of the world, both animate and inanimate, that may, only with difficulty, if at all, be rendered with words. In addition to being the director of the SEL, Lucian Casting Taylor was previously the editor of the Visual Anthropology Review in the early 1990s, and he's made a number of key contributions to the development of sensory ethnography, an emergent subfield of anthropology which questions many of its assumptions and disciplinary boundaries, as well as brings together a variety of concerns with the body, experience, affect, aesthetics, and phenomenology. Casting Taylor is the author and editor of at least 4 important scholarly texts heralding and theorizing the sensory turn, including a critical meditation on ethnographic film entitled Iconophobia, published in 1966, where he argues in favor of, quote, the lyricism of lived experience, unquote, captured by cinema's experientially dense moving images. In his co-authored introduction to an edited collection on filmmaker Robert Gardner, Casting Taylor further posits that the increasing turn to the visual and the cinematic represents, quote, an effort to elaborate a fundamentally post-semiotic anthropology that foregrounds the phenomenological priority of embodiment in our apprehension of the world as the existential condition of possibility of both self and culture. While Casting Taylor is seeking a way out of the linguistic overdetermination of the ethnographic encounter, to reorient and re-embody experience and knowledge as more than effects of language and ideology, he also does this at the cost, perhaps, of social and historical contextualization. His sensory approach risks not only reinstating certain cultural and social essentialisms that might themselves be questioned by a more critically distanced methodology or technique, but it can also leave unexamined and obscure its own appeals to immediacy, the body, subjectivity, touch, and so on, all existentially and phenomenologically important ways to explore the world and to ground knowledge, to be sure, but cultural and social, indeed political notions too, that can be made to serve different logics of power and ideological ends. Nevertheless, the SEL's ambitious mandate is devoted to producing a kind of ethnographic film that is materialist and phenomenological, one that burrows into experience. This turn towards sensual and structural ontology that embraces an aggressive observational mode as its primary aesthetic is indicative of a more general shift from the deconstructive textuality of postmodern ethnography found in works like Trinity Minha's Reassemblage. And indeed, it openly champions the aesthetic as such, not as a term to be repressed and derided, but actively cultivated as a crucial dimension of existence. In his series of interviews with Scott MacDonald, Casting Taylor emphasizes the influence of American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey on his approach. In Art as Experience, Dewey develops what is essentially a phenomenology of art that grounds it in the rich materiality and expressiveness of everyday life. Here is a sample from Dewey. In order to understand the aesthetic in its ultimate and approved forms, one must begin with it in the raw, in the events and scenes that hold the attentive eye and ear of man, arousing his interest and affording him enjoyment as he looks and listens. The sights that hold the crowd, the fire engine rushing by, the machines excavating enormous holes in the earth, the human fly climbing the steeple side, the men perched high in air on girders, throwing and catching red-hot bolts. The sources of art in human experience will be learned by him who sees how the tense grace of the ball player infects the onlooking crowd, who notes the delight of the housewife in tending her plants, and the intent interest of her goodman in tending the patch of green in front of the house, the zest of the spectator in poking the wood burning on the hearth, and in watching the darting flames and crumbling coals. These people, if questioned as to the reason for their actions, would doubtless return reasonable answers. The man who poked the sticks of burning wood would say he did it to make the fire burn better, but he is nonetheless fascinated by the colorful drama of change enacted before his eyes and imaginatively partakes in it. He does not remain a cold spectator. So what we see in Dewey's evocative prose here, his description, his sort of phenomenological description, is an investment in the aspects of everyday life that are not simply about representations, but are about the meeting points, the gatherings between different things, between different forms that elicit and that provoke, that call forth responses and activities. So things that become collective. So these things that are also have reciprocities and that share in their materiality, that share in their shapes and their processes, and therefore form combinations. So we have shared materials and shared forms. There is also a sense, I think, in this Dewey quote of something that is different from the idea of the world as merely information or as something abstract. There is a sense of the distinct, the singular, the embodied action. So we could see, for example, how a person pouring tea, to take one instance, is at once a cultural or gestural practice that is repeatable and that is culturally specific and produces information and meaning. But we can also understand how this gesture of pouring tea is a unique existential event. And the cinema, Casting Taylor, I think, would argue, can capture the sound and the image and perhaps even the feeling of a specific action such as pouring tea. And in this way, the action, the distinct specific act, the single time one does it, becomes valuable in itself and not simply as an instance of a larger action, such as the cultural form of pouring tea, you might say. The sensory turn in ethnographic film places greater value on other dimensions of experience and perception, such as sound and touch, in an overall effort, then, to move away from abstractions and ready-made categories of knowledge. To this end, recent ethnographic films made at the SEL deploy new audiovisual technologies and aesthetic strategies to locate meaning as an embodied experience. Released to wide acclaim in 2012, the SEL production Leviathan can be considered a key film in sensory ethnography. In a number of interviews, Casting Taylor and Verena Paravel, the co-makers of the film, have made explicit their desire to not subordinate the film and its images, the experiences and the sensations they conjure, to language and pre-established models of knowledge, that is, to the logos. As Casting Taylor puts it, quote, "We are not trying to say anything. Films, like everything humans make, are about something in some way. But to imagine that they are about something that could be expressed in words, outside of the fabric of the film itself, is kind of ludicrous, because then you wouldn't make the film, you would write it." Indeed, for Casting Taylor, cinema provides a certain escape from the tyranny of the linguistic model of understanding culture. As he once wrote, quote, "What makes film so captivating is that it is something other or more than just language. Indeed, given the apparent affinity of film with life itself, moving images evoking moving life, hearing evoking hearing, and seeing seeing, given the centrality of the life world to anthropology, given the exemplary open-endedness of ethnography, whose wealth of detail is always supposed to transcend the theoretical services to which it may be put, and given the attention anthropologists have devoted lately to representations of the body and to the embodiment of experience, the backlash against film, no less than the ongoing desire to linguify it, seems all the more unlikely." Shifting from our discussion of theory to the film itself, it is worthwhile to point out some of the film Leviathan's cinematic forebears. These films can serve as intertexts and reference points in our apprehension and appreciation of the film. In terms of theme, one of the main precedents for Leviathan is Drifters, John Gerson's 1929 documentary about labor aboard a fishing trawler. And in terms of form, one has to take into account the metaphysically oriented and aesthetically powerful films of Robert Gardner, notably his 1986 Forest of Bliss. In the broadest of terms, both Drifters and Forest of Bliss center around water and the human activity that takes place around and upon it. This human activity, moreover, is shown in both films to be intimately connected to other forms of animal life in an ecological web of interconnected relations. But perhaps the key thematic and aesthetic precedents for Leviathan are the previous films of the filmmakers themselves, such as Casting Taylor's 2009 Sweetgrass, made with his partner Elissa Barbash, and anthropologist Verena Pavel and filmmaker J.P. Snydecki's 2010 Foreign Parts, both films experiments in a kind of modernist salvage ethnography. Sweetgrass meditates on the twilight of cowboys and a mythically American sheep drive across the mountains of Montana. Foreign Parts, constructing a post-observational ethnographic portrait of a soon-to-be scattered outsider community of people who live amongst auto scraps and recycling shops in a junkyard in Queens, New York. These works, as well as Leviathan, also anticipate later Casting Taylor and Parvel experiments conducted under the auspices of the SEL, such as 2017's Somniliquid, which the Documentifestival catalog describes in the following way. In Somniliquid's dream talker Dion McGregor's nightly musings are coupled with images of sleeping nudes, a roving camera that moves indiscernibly from one contour and orifice to another, one body to another, one gender to another, one ethnicity to another, one animal to another. And Caniba, also released in 2017, which the Venice Biennale describes as a film, quote, that reflects on the discomfiting significance of cannibalistic desire in human existence through the prism of one Japanese man, Issei Sagawa, and his mysterious relationship with his brother. Like Leviathan, these two films press themselves into their subjects with extreme close-ups, generating at times suffocating and at times alienating, yet viscerally intimate sensations. Objects and subjects in these films often become opaque, blurred, fuzzy, as if touched by and themselves touching the camera eye. Fundamental to this aesthetic, indeed this erotic strategy, is a negation or escape from representational distance and the meanings that emerge therefrom. These films seem to hold knowledge in classical ethnographic form in a state of suspension, and connected to this suspension of knowledge, they withhold judgment as well. Leviathan was shot in 2010 to 2011 off the coast of New Bedford, Massachusetts, the fabled setting of Herman Melville's 19th century sea story, Moby Dick. The novel serves as a kind of intertext with the film, informing it with mythical resonances and undertones. Indeed, as they have stated in numerous interviews, the filmmakers took to reading passages of the book to each other in downtime from shooting, that is, when they were not heaving over the side of the boat or barely sleeping. One of the most obvious and notable features of Leviathan belongs to its mode or technical method of production. Shot with a battery of small digital video cameras, some 14 GoPro Hero sports cameras, the filmmakers delegated the labor and creativity of shooting to a variety of actors involved in the film event. Attaching the cameras directly to the fishermen's bodies, heads, and limbs, as well as to various places on the ship and on poles that could be dunked into the water, the filmmakers willingly divested themselves of their authority and agency in producing many of the images, in this respect practicing a kind of shared anthropology. Following in the footsteps of Ruch's notion of shared anthropology, Leviathan then might be seen as sharing or decentering and redistributing its authority with the ship, the animals, and indeed the environment itself. According to the filmmakers, this shared anthropology, or collective encounter, was paradoxically intended to disturb and redistribute authorship, to generate images that broke with conventions of Renaissance space, and to, quote, create a multiplicity of perspectives that would relativize the human perspectives and make the spectator rethink humanity's relationship to nature, in relationship to a plethora of other beings, of other animals, of other kinds of animate and inanimate objects, the elements, the earth, the sky, the sea, the boat, mechanization, fish, crustaceans, starfish, everything that is involved in the ecology of what's going on in industrial fishing today, end quote. On this level, prior to editing and sound mixing, the film was in a sense less authorized by the filmmakers, and indeed strangely hypermediated by the chaotic forces of the various bodies and forces in and surrounding the ecology of the ship, thus bringing the ethnographic desire to discover and record together with both the intensely intimate and the alien. In this way, the composite creature that is Leviathan, so Castaigne Taylor and Paravel argue, brings us closer to the visceral and the affective, that is, pre-linguistic experience of industrial fishing, at the same time that it displaces the human subject as center of attention, interest, and meaning. Again, the filmmakers turn to a notion of the cosmic to explain. Quote, in Leviathan, we were after a representation of humanity that feels to us ultimately more humble because it's decontextualized in a wider environmental and cosmic realm, one that tests between the intimately anthropocentric and the uncannily extraterrestrial, unquote. In the watery depths that Leviathan explores through the technological conditions of the GoPro cameras, the human subject as historical actor, whether ethnographic filmmaker or fisherman come photographer or film viewer, is subsumed into a much grander scheme that swallows up history, culture, politics, and perhaps even language itself. In this way, Leviathan openly embraces the sensory aesthetic in its carnal and its cosmic vision of life at sea, of sea life. And in these aspects can be found some of the ways to differentiate Leviathan from other recent nonfiction films about the environment, ecology, industrial fishing, or the food industry, such as 2008's Food Inc., or the melodramatic reality television show The Deadliest Catch, which can be heard in the ship's cabin in Leviathan. To conclude, I turn to a film from outside anthropology and ethnographic film that can help further elucidate the aesthetic stakes of Leviathan. Avant-garde filmmaker Michael Snow's 1971 La Région Centrale is a 3-hour experiment in perception in which a remotely operated and disembodied camera virtuosically and uncannily pans, scans, and tilts on its axis to provide myriad angles and disorientations from which to view a desolate northern landscape. Let us consider Snow's computer-assisted camera operations and the wide array of unsettling points of view, as well as the technical constraints that help condition them in La Région Centrale alongside those of Leviathan. This is a clip from La Région Centrale. In his Iconophobia essay, Casting Taylor refers to the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard's argument that, quote, the ambiguity and opacity of the perceptual medium will always upset orders of prosaic textual representation with their yearning for clarity and lucidity, unquote. What Lyotard once wrote of La Region Centrale's ambiguous and commentary-free stare at the landscape, then, might indeed hold for Leviathan as well. As Lyotard observes in his essay, The Unconscious as Mise en Scène, quote, we should use these works to set up perspectives of realities with an eye on enjoying heretofore unexperienced intensities. The machines which are drawn into play are, essentially, no longer the machines of illusion and memory, but apparati for experimentation which permit us to quarter sensibility and draw it out beyond this old body. Unquote. We can see in the aesthetic operations of Leviathan perhaps something similar to that Lyotard observes in La Region Centrale, an animating tension between that of seemingly total or immersive coverage, embodied by the new mobility of the camera, and so on, that escapes from the old body of traditional humanism and representation, on the one hand, and a generalized obscurity and opacity, if not evasion, of meaning on the other. It is for these reasons that Paravel describes the experience of making Leviathan, as well as the finished film, as something, quote, bloody and dark and strange, unquote, evoking the tropes of science fiction and horror, as well as the avant-garde film, alongside more conventional ethnographic qualities. In this way, Leviathan foregoes the conventional ethnographic film's investment in empirically and didactically grounded representational forms, such as voiceover, interview, subtitles, etc., alongside standards of framing and narrative or argumentative shot construction in order to get closer to, as it were, the things themselves, which is to say, the chaotic movements, routine labor, animal destruction and interaction, the web of life established between all of these and the practice of image making itself, at once representational and abstract, in a word, figural, as the filmmakers put it. Effectively, for Casting Taylor and Paravel, the cinematic vision machine can help the human being to escape from the confines of the text to the expansive terrain of the body and the dwelling space of the animal. In Leviathan, then, the sensory turn designates something more than mere art history, intertextual allusion, cultivated taste, or the production of cultural meaning or scientific knowledge. For Casting Taylor and Paravel, the sensory turn names an aesthetic mode that seems, at once, to return to and to explode the original desire of the ethnographic film, going all the way back to Félix Louis Regnault in terms of seeking to know and to experience the world through the visual, the embodied, and the gestural. It also names a desire that we could describe as the human passion to escape ourselves, that is, to rediscover our animality, to cinematically undergo our own bestialization. I am reminded here, finally, of Senegalese filmmaker Ousmane Sembène's famous criticism of Jean Rouch and in his effort to develop a shared anthropology with his cine eye ear. Sembène observed that for all his apparently humanist intentions, Rouch nevertheless looked at the African people as if they were insects. We might say something similar about the way Leviathan views its subjects. Casting Taylor and Paravel, however, would take this as confirmation that they are in fact doing something right. Okay, so with this questioning of the human subject and the representation of the human subject in Leviathan in mind, we can go to our questions and discussion. So the first topic returns us to In My Language, and I would like for us to discuss the role of translation in Mel Baggs' video. We could consider the function of translation for the documentary value of the video. And how do you think In My Language would work without the second half, the A translation section? Do you think it is useful, moreover, to think of In My Language as an essay film, as I suggested in the first half of this video? Second, building on the first question, we can discuss the relationship between In My Language's form, that is, its stylistic and aesthetic qualities, including things like, but not limited to, framing, lighting, editing, or montage, and so forth, and its way of presencing, in Hito Sterl's sense, of the meaning of things, right? What is this meaning of things if it's not only or necessarily linguistic or neurotypical meaning of things? Consider further the role of the haptic, as Laura Marks writes, of the touching sensation of video In My Language. How does the film's form contribute to its political message, as it were, about recognizing difference and rethinking human but also other modalities of being, belonging, and community? And not only human community. Is the distribution and reception of the video on YouTube, remembering that this was a video disseminated on YouTube with millions of hits at this juncture in the 13 years, 14 years since it was first published, is this distribution on YouTube also significant in the film's, as it were, political message and form? Third, turning to Leviathan, consider the sensations in and of Leviathan. Does the film's aesthetics of immersion, as it has been described by many critics, provide its human viewers with something approaching a de-anthropomorphized or post-human and de-centered point of view of industrial fishing? And if so, what are the consequences of this anthropomorphic decentering, this decentering of the human subject for the film's status as an ethnographic film, if we understand an ethnographic film as being about the ethnos of a people, of representing the ethnos of a people? And finally, what kind of image of the world, natural and artificial, both of those things together, do the makers of Leviathan create? Who or what is responsible for this image or this aggregate of images in Leviathan? In your discussion, it might be helpful to consider the different but interconnected roles of humans, animals, machines, and the environment in the film. So I look forward to discussing all of these with you in our chat on Friday, as well as on the message board on Canvas. Thanks.